All right. Well, this is Jonathan Delman. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for attending this webinar. We expect it to be informative to the degree that you want to learn about what's in the toolkit, and some of you may have already checked it out, but if not, this will give you an introduction. So we have a lot of toolkit chapters, 9 of them, and I think they all cover very important topics. In addition, we have appendices that include an organizational self-assessment for readiness to employ young adult peers. We provide examples in there, pointers, and even some forms to help you get through some difficult issues. And we have lots of links in there. So even as relatively thick as this toolkit is, we link to other places such as laws or compilations of best practices that are best left to other people. So there's a lot in here, and a good amount of depth and breadth. So you don't have to read every page. A lot of where you start will depend on where you are in the process of thinking about hiring young adult peers, hiring them, or, some people are at a very much a pre-contemplation stage, and at that case, you probably want to start at the beginning, which provides some background on and our rationale for doing this toolkit. We feel that there's a real need and demand for it based on different, based on the amount of people on this call, in part. Also, we talk about the essential features of a peer specialist and some of the challenges. So we go from the description to the large picture, the organizational culture and framework that it's really important for employing young adult peers, down to supervision, addressing job difficulties. And those are the things you get into as you really begin to hire people. So we got a lot of pre-webinar questions that we may not be able to answer directly on this call, but we are a federally funded TA center, and by emailing myself or Vanessa, we will respond to individual questions, primarily by referring you to parts of the toolkit, but we also can spend some time with you and talk to you about it. We hope that this webinar really directs people to the right places, but we are available. In addition, sorry. So we have this large toolkit, and towards the end we have 9 primary takeaways of this slide deck. Plus, those takeaways are on page 7. And what I'm interested in are those other people's perspectives on the right takeaways. You might think, oh no, we're doing this and we realize you should have another takeaway in there. So we're interested in that as well. So next slide. Right, so Vanessa and I are the co-authors of this toolkit, and both have complementary experience. Mine is in large part being a consumer and having been through the process of both hiring peers and working for organizations and understanding the challenges. I'm a researcher and evaluator specifically in the young adult area, and I've been doing research in this area back to 2000 when I first met Mary Ann Davis, who we work with now. And in the first report we did in Massachusetts, which at that time really didn't have anything, we recommended, this is 2002, both youth voice and peer mentors. And you can't really have peer mentors without youth voice. Youth voice really can inform your policies and practices beyond this toolkit. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, and Vanessa's a social worker, and I'll let her introduce herself. Next slide.
Hey guys, thanks John. So I bring, as complement to John, a clinical social work background to this work, and my primary appointment is at Thresholds, which is the largest community mental health provider in Illinois, and has a very long, rich history within the recovery movement and integrating peers throughout our vast service array. I was new to the peer integration in the youth and young adult sector, and I happen to have an amazing opportunity, and it's been such a fulfilling opportunity to really partner with young adults. And we had a project where there's webinars and a couple of papers we've produced. These are all available on the Transitions RTC website, where we developed a peer mentoring program for vocational services within Thresholds with Transitions RTC. And I was able to help develop that, implement it, and then supervise the young adults who filled these roles. And it's through that experience that I really draw a lot of my examples and my ideas. But then the last few years, it's been John and I working on this project and talking to people across the country and learning about the challenges and the solutions that people have come up with. And so I bring a slightly different background that's very complementary to John's. Back to you, John.
Oh, your keep going.
Oh, all right. So I think I'm going to move on to the next one. So yeah, essentially, if you're either thinking about integrating young adults in the peer provider role, or you're already integrating young adults in the peer provider role, you've probably recognized that they have some really unique qualities that I actually would argue it's a very challenging position to have, and that you need, and the toolkit is this, you need practice and policies and foundational philosophy really in place at your organization in order to help support this really unique role. What peers do in the real world, in the adult side as well, is they're using their resiliency story with their clients. And with young adults and youth, it's going to be also with their families, and they're going to use their story in strategic ways. What's really interesting about the young adult world, and we don't have time to spend on, what does it mean to transition to adulthood, but what I can say about it is it's a very complex time in development where there is immense instability. And so if you're an organization thinking about integrating young adult peer providers, you have to be thoughtful that the young adult peer providers you hire are going to be in some part of this really complex, challenging life phase, and they're going to be also working with young people in that very complex, challenging life phase as well. And so it just is a really unique and very, I would argue, meaningful addition to the service array for young adults. What I want to also highlight is that we also expect young adults in these roles, for better or for worse, to be role models and exemplars. We expect them to come with a recovery story, a resiliency story, and they're going to be able to take care of themselves on the job and do well, and show and be an example to their peers, other colleagues who are non-peers or perhaps middle or older adults who they work with, that yes, a young adult can have their stuff together, and they can have a diagnosis of serious mental health condition, but they can do it. They can do work well. The problem with this is it can be very challenging, and something I think a lot about and could coach a lot of people on is that this is really unfair, that we need to be aware that young adults cannot always be perfect on the job, that we need to be thoughtful about what that looks like. And in fact, we as perhaps non-peers or as older staff, middle-aged to older, need to really take a step back and think, how can we be role models? How can we be transparent about how we're doing in a way if we're expecting young adults to be doing this role? And finally, one thing I want to really emphasize, and I'll get to this in my supervision piece a little bit, is the essence of mutuality, and I'm also going to add fun. And so what young adult peers do is they bring youth culture and fun, and God forbid that clinical treatment is a fun experience. And so I think that builds on the idea from the recovery movement that mutuality and bonding and companionship and then hope is the crux of peer support. I think fun is really important, and also relationship building with peers is a key developmental task during the transition to adulthood, so it makes sense for this to be a part of services. So in my work in implementing this and talking to folks across the country, there are a lot of challenges to integrating young adult peers effectively, which is what the toolkit aims to address from a macro standpoint of an organizational standpoint down to a direct practice standpoint. How can you really help an organization to do a good job of supporting young adult peers in this really unique role? And if you do that well, then it's going to actually affect the young people and their families that are your clients. What is the general challenge that we see is that young people entering into these peer provider roles are new to the professional work environment, and so that can be challenging. They also are young adults, and we want them to be young adults. We want them to bring who they are to the job. That's the peer piece. But that can also be challenging because you also want them to know enough to be able to communicate effectively with their colleagues that are people who are perhaps not familiar with youth culture or the transition to adulthood and what it looks like today. One thing that I mentioned I really need to emphasize is the lack of role clarity. This is something that we see in general with youth peer provider roles, is that it looks different. It looks different from provider to provider, from state to state, and there's no right or wrong for what the role needs to be. It's what makes sense for your context, but then you have to be really specific about what that role is. Otherwise, it's going to result in some role confusion. Non-peer staff and middle-aged older adult staff will kind of be like, what's the deal with these young adult peers? What are they doing? Why are they doing my job? Are they replicating it? What do they bring? What is the added value? And that opens up a whole can of worms if you're not thoughtful about clarifying the role. And this, just to finally mention, before I pass it on to John, is, and you're going to hear me talk about supervision, when you integrate young adult peers into your organization, you're going to have some, your teams are going to have to accommodate, and your supervisors of these young adult peer providers are also going to have to change the way that they do supervision. And so just being thoughtful about that, like it is challenging if the folks who are in place don't buy into the role, don't get it, and then don't want to help develop the role and better integrate it in your organization. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, John.
Thank you, and I must say that Vanessa very efficiently covered chapters 1 through 3. So
hey.
her excellent description, there is more depth for you to look at. So organizational culture is chapter 4, and many young adults really emphasize the fact that it could be challenging to work in a place because of the way other staff might be perceiving things. And culture is really a combination of behavior, practice, and policies. How people talk every day. So it's going to be difficult for a peer to work in a place where people with lived experience are talked about as mental patients, or if this still happens, or if they're talked about as psychiatrically damaged, because in part that's not person-first language, but it's also, not friendly language. And part of a good culture is respecting clients, and regardless of whether you like them or not, respecting them, but also using language that is more descriptive. So it could be a young adult with a serious mental health condition or a young adult who has obsessive compulsive disorder. So there is a language piece to this. So we have 8 elements here. I'm going to go over 3 in a little more detail. And the first one is really valuing peer support. Does the organization value how the peer works with using his or her recovery story, disclosure? And a lot of staff may look down on that based on their training, based on, having to set up boundaries in their clinical work. But peer support has boundaries too. We have a section there on ethics, and peers have very similar boundaries with their people they're working with. The main difference is they strategically use their recovery story to inspire hope and the other things Vanessa talked about. So the experience of young adults is frankly different from the experience of the last generation of young adults and the generation before that. In part, that's the advancement of technology. In part, it's the what's happening in the world. So young adults now have a different present. than previous young adults. Or some young adults a generation or so ago were close to 9/11, and that's changed it. The world economy is really, you know, making anxious a lot of people, including young adults, and we need to understand from young adults, but there are differences in understanding them. Obviously, stigma, legal obligations to not discriminate, are they taken seriously? A respect for diversity of opinions, basically. You don't have to agree with them, but, you know, making an effort to try to understand a different way, because there are different perspectives on providing care, and in particular in this case, where peers bring a different view than often what exists in the workplace. A positive youth development approach, we have some detail on that in the toolkit, but that's to a certain degree the practitioner who uses, helps a client develop their meta development skills so they can make decisions for themselves. So helping the client, being positive, building trust as the foundation of the work. So that's how peers work, essentially. So if practitioners are working more from a deficit-based approach, which is the historical approach, is we're just going to address those symptoms and keep the person stable, whereas the peer is coming in thinking like, all right, that's okay, but we also have to focus forward and building on their strengths to help them move forward. There will be clashes, and that gets to number 7, self-determination and dignity of risk, which is a foundation for the recovery-oriented approach. And what it assumes is a presumption of competence among clients, which is the law, essentially. Like, the first thing you think when you meet a client is often, well, this person, they're messy, they're disheveled, they don't know what they're doing, I'm going to make all the decisions for them. And often that's what happens with parents, and that's sort of understandable if you have an experience with the person. But the peer approaches it like, all right, let's see if a person really wants to think about their employment and hear their opinions. And, you know, with that, the person will build up their competence, and that kind of approach may actually clash with a clinical approach. But bigger than that is the dignity of risk and self-determination. So that is that young adults in the developmental phase will often make decisions that are questionable to older people. But that's how they learn. You know, a lot of us have done things and made mistakes, and we've learned. And maybe for the person with a psychiatric condition, there may be greater magnitude of difficulty there. But I'll just quickly give you an example where I've seen that. Well, I've seen that be effective with medications, where a psychiatrist stayed with a young adult even though they went off medications, didn't work out. So the trust was much stronger after the psychiatrist stayed with the person and let the person follow their desire, legitimate desire to be off medications, but it didn't work out. So it ended up very well. The person learned something that for them, they probably needed to, for them to, at least for the time being, be on medications. Finally, employee access to wellness tools, supports, and services. We have quite a bit of that in there. And actually, this is becoming more common in the workplace. So one of the evidence-based practices is building resilience tools in the workplace. So I see a lot of workplaces, providers in particular, that have mindfulness groups. And exercise is known to be effective in helping people maintain health in the workplace. I see people trying to have exercise groups, walks. Those are very positive cultural components that, A, makes a person, a peer, feel better, but also allows them to bridge with the practitioners in a more natural way. There's also good health insurance, and we have employee assistance programs, which can be very effective when they are able to connect employees to good mental health programs. They should already have that network set up. And what really works is when an employee is having trouble, it's very important to address that trouble, health trouble, right away, mental health trouble. Because if you wait too long, things in the workplace may get worse. So it's important for the EAP or something to that effect to really have good connections with mental health services. And the good thing is that the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act is directing state voc rehab organizations to focus more on the employer's needs, and part of that is helping them understand how to do a better job at employing people with mental health conditions and people with disabilities. So this is the whole organizational culture that really needs to be considered when you're thinking about bringing in a peer. Next. Yes. Sorry. So we have recruiting and hiring. A lot of people asked about recruiting in this in your questions. We reviewed them. But recruiting is really it's not the first thing you do until you do other things first. And there's an order. We have an order here in which you do that. So before you get to number 6, which is recruiting, we've talked about this a bit. And Vanessa's talked about defining what the peer is in your context. That could be, for example, they're working with a specific population, such as people with forensic backgrounds or dual diagnoses. What office do they work out of? What are the other things that make them a peer? Then you have to step back and describe the key functions of the peer position. And Vanessa alluded to those with the unique qualities, but those have to be described, and there may be some additional functions. Then you step back and you establish job qualifications. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a second. You absolutely need a written job description before you hire. This way, applicants know what they're applying for, and you get the right applicants, and the interviewers know what they're interviewing for. It's right there in paper, and it also helps with evaluation a little bit later. Classification and pay, talk about that quickly. Then you do the recruiting, and then we'll talk about interviewing. Next slide, please. So the recruiting. It's not rocket science, really. I talked about having clear job descriptions and recruiting notices. So when you don't want to, it shouldn't just be a word of mouth email that says, we're looking for a young peer. I mean, what does that really tell you? It doesn't tell you what the job is, and it's really important to get it down on paper. Not everybody does this. Now, believe it or not, salary and benefits and career path matter when you're recruiting, obviously. And that's something really to think about. A lot of these salaries are on the lower side, but sometimes you can attract people also by the potential for career growth within the organization. So you want to build a job that people are attracted to. All staff are recruiters to the degree they know what the peer role is. So you want everybody in your organization to this is a pretty cool job, actually. It's tough, it's cool. But to the degree people in the provider organization understand this job, they will be recruiting friends and family maybe, or people like that. Connect with these organizations beforehand and be aware of how you attract people through the internet. Next, please. Job qualifications. So I'm going to skip the primary ones, but one of the things I really point out in the toolkit is direct services job criteria tend to screen out young adults with serious mental health conditions. Think about that. So if you're requiring a master's or a BA, that screens out a lot of young adults with mental health conditions. Criminal history, big. A lot of young adults have that. It may be for very small things, minor misdemeanors, and yet the organization may screen out anybody with a conviction, and that's really not good. And in fact, the Department of Justice, and we quote this in the toolkit, has provided pretty clear guidelines on recruiting and hiring people with criminal histories. And what they say is, A, avoid exclusions unless they're legally mandated, or some crimes may be clearly things that don't match up with what you're looking for, but, you know, theft, some aspects of theft, selling drugs, I'm trying to think of a few other things. Traffic violations can get you a record. You really want to not use those as factors, because, you know, the best peers can often be people who have been through that, who have been through a criminal background. They've had the toughest times, and they're coming back. And what you want to hear from them, I think, is that, you know, I've had this criminal history, I've improved myself, this is how I've done it. And, you know, you give a person a chance. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Interviewing. So you will interview candidates. So I'm going to go down again to the bottom there. And again, questions can often screen out people, even if they're not related, or they are related, because they can discourage people. And we're going to talk again about asking questions about criminal record. So what the Department of Justice advises is, unless a criminal record in some aspects disqualifies someone, you don't ask it in the first interview. Otherwise, you may, even if the person remains eligible for the job, you may be discouraging people from continuing the process because they feel like you really hold that really highly. It's better to get to know the person, the young adult peer, as who they are, and then at a certain point you can ask them about that. And this way you're drawing people in, getting to know them, and you can make your assessment. But again, another piece of criminal records is you may want to help them to expunge their record if it's a misdemeanor. And we have a good discussion in there in the toolkit on that. Next. Oh, this is Vanessa.
Okay, so we get a lot of questions about training and how should young adults be trained and prepared for these positions. And what we believe in our philosophy is that training is part of supervision. Training is an ongoing process that young people engage in as they're doing the work. Currently, and you're going to hear, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the supervisor becomes really important in that. Having specific guidelines or guides and toolkits or available materials for how to train young adults in these unique positions are not typically publicly available. There are some, like the GIFT model by Kim Bissett, there are models out there. And I would say to look, and that's something I'm working on with John, is to try to figure out where are the resources out there specifically in regards to training. But what I can tell you, in the last few years of us connecting with lots of people and myself developing a training program for young people at thresholds in peer provider roles, specifically in the youth programs, is that these types of trainings need to include motivational interviewing, active listening, addressing confidentiality, what is that? But they also, importantly, have to have a strong element, and this is an ongoing training element to be used in supervision around self-discovery. And so if you think back, and if you're someone that holds an L in counseling or social work, you spent a lot of time in your educational period learning about yourself and your biases and what you bring to the work, as you're also learning about clinical interventions. And so what you need to do is really be thoughtful. Organizations need to be thoughtful that young people in these peer provider roles who are new to these roles need to go through some training exercises that are ongoing that help them to learn who they are, what they bring to the work, and how they're changing as they go through their own transition to adulthood. One thing I want to highlight, and John, you'll like this because I'm kind of going into new territory right here, is around, and this is in the toolkit, but I don't think it's as specific as what I'm going to say right now, is around self-disclosure is often something that we're just freaked out about as clinicians. And I think we need to get away, as John had said earlier, that language is so important. And what we need to be thoughtful about is what relationships mean, what is storytelling, how do you tell stories in a resilient way, how do you tell them strategically, and that these are key parts of training, but also how do you positively reinforce role modeling? What is role modeling, and how do young people do that, and how can an organization ensure that young people are role models, because that often is a key unique quality of this young adult peer provider position. And quickly, I just want to mention that I really, really like the philosophy and practice behind strategic storytelling. At the end of this webinar, we have some resources. They're also in the toolkit as well, but around what that is, and it's the idea is that you're owning your story as you're telling it. You're not allowing your client and the family or whoever your audience is to tell you what that story means, even though you're telling the story in a certain way to evoke a certain emotion or thought process or behavior change in a client. It's just really, really important to be thoughtful and to have storytelling. I suggest doing group supervision and having a storytelling exercise at least quarterly where young people are getting together for a few hours and practicing storytelling. Quickly, as you've heard me mention already, supervisors have a really unique role. They are facilitators and supporters of young adult peers and you're going to hear me use this word a lot, alliances, strong working alliances. I do not want folks who are working with young adult peer providers to constantly be consumed with relational boundary violations and that's the thing we should focus on, preventing those. No, what we should be focusing on is helping young adult peers build strong working alliances with their clients, their families, their colleagues, and also their supervisors. Also, a supervisor has an interesting role. They become a champion and advocate for the young adult peer role. Just by default of being the supervisor, they're going to end up educating their colleagues, perhaps their supervisors, perhaps other stakeholders about the value that young adults bring to the treatment context and what lived experience can mean for that. They also become role models themselves. If there's supervisors out there on the phone right now, if you are asking young adults to really share their lived experience and practice self-care and be a role model, get ready to do it yourself. And you're also going to have to coach. And so naturally, as you're probably hearing me speak, you have to think about the right people for these supervisory roles, people that really truly want to develop their staff. And also, of course, supervisors in these roles need to be very attuned to their young adults in these roles. They need to be aware of what's going on with them. And you can do that through achieving a strong working alliance between your supervisor and young adult peer providers. Key supervision topics. Supervision is something that is an ongoing process. It is not something that is it cannot be just like structured once a week. We're going to on task. Did you meet with this person? How did it go? No, it has to incorporate these, I argue, 5 key elements. Yes, there needs to be some task-based supervision that you're checking up on. Is the young person doing what they need to be doing? But also, there needs to be thought around, we need to really talk about self-care, planning for self-care, and addressing barriers to maintaining good self-care. There also has to be a career development aspect of this. These young adults will not be young adults forever. And so you have to build into your supervision practice, hey, what are your next steps? What are you thinking about? And guess what? By doing that, you will help your young people in these peer provider roles think about career, think about next steps, and they then can use what they're learning through that process with you and your organization to work with their clients on their own career development as well as self-care. It's all a great trickle-down parallel process, which I'm totally into, and I have a slide on that coming up. Also, definitely there's this big piece of building skills and confidence and competency in these young people to really engage this group of young adult clients and youth clients that are typically recognized as challenging to engage in typical mental health treatment. And finally, and this is the most important part and should have a much bigger bullet for it or bigger box, is a real focus on examining and reflecting upon the working alliances and the associated relational processes that are the crux of peer support. In order to do this, I suggest and have found a lot of I really, really like the practice of reflective supervision. We have some resources in the toolkit for how to do this, but essentially it is a collaborative process that a supervisor and a young adult peer provider engage in together. It is really the foundation of it is a strong working alliance, and that you, during the supervision practice, you are consistently reflecting upon what is happening for young adults in these peer provider roles in their building of a strong working alliance with their clients and their colleagues, might I add. Here are the key pieces and the key things that I've developed over the years of thinking through what are the relational processes that we should develop. So instead of focusing on, ooh, let's not have relational boundaries be violated, you want to be thoughtful of to what extent, when you're supervising and you've got your young adult peer provider with you, to what extent is there authenticity in my relationship or my bond or my alliance with my client? To what extent is there trust? To what extent is there empathy? Am I empathetic? Is the client empathetic? To what extent is there companionship? And yes, this will freak out some really medical model heavy settings, but this is what peer support is, and we need to get on board with really examining these things and building strong working alliances, because that's how young adults and peer provider roles are going to engage their clients. And one quick reason why it's really important to build a strong working alliance, and you can see if you're nodding your head and you're thinking, oh, I remember the working alliance, it matters for clinical interventions to be effective if there's a strong working alliance, a strong therapeutic alliance. It has to do with shared goals, shared tasks, and a strong bond. But why it really matters to have a strong working alliance between a supervisor and a young adult peer provider is in the case that a young person in this role starts to struggle. You want them to come to you and talk about that as soon as possible so that then you can start to address things and prevent what John has alluded to more struggles on the job. And as I mentioned, that this alliance building practice and this foundation of focusing on a working alliance is just so crucial to the practice of supervision. It's crucial because there's a trickle-down effect, or a trickle-across effect might be the right way to talk about it, that if you as a supervisor are working really hard to make a strong or to develop a strong working alliance with your young adult peer providers, that they then can model some of that behavior and those thoughts and those processes with their clients, and they also can model it with their colleagues, and perhaps you can even model it with your own colleagues as well. This, and John and I talk a lot about this, this is just good supervision practice. It doesn't necessarily apply specifically to people with lived experience. And finally, if you're like, what are you saying? It's all about focusing on relationships and alliances. Yes, you have to also have some hard and fast rules in place in regards to ethical behavior. For instance, and here's my, a bucket list of things of what should be forbidden. Now, these things are things you would train at early on, and then you have to consistently reinforce that these are standards of practice respect that you have as part of your practice as a young adult peer provider. But one thing I just want to remind folks of, and this is something I learned in implementing and supervising young adult peers, is young adult peers, when they share their stuff, when they share their story, or they share, what they're going through right in the moment with their clients aren't held to the same kind of confidentiality and HIPAA agreement that we are held to as practitioners with client information. And so if you work within an environment where you've got young adult peers, clients that are coming into interaction or interacting with each other, often a young adult peer provider's experience, their story, or their experience that they shared in the moment that might have been raw for them with one of their clients might be shared like wildfire. That's something we talk about in the toolkit, something I do a lot of training on, is you have to really be thoughtful about coaching young adult peers about when to share their experience and how and why, and that's where strategic storytelling comes into place. And finally, before I pass it back to John, I just have to give a big plug out there. If you're an administrator on the phone or a policymaker, I really want you to be thoughtful about, it's really important to figure out how to support young adults in these roles. It's also really important to figure out how to support supervisors in doing this work. Supervisors need support, they need training, they need people they can process this with as well. Okay, on to accommodations.
Great, thanks Vanessa. And by the way, that was chapter 5. And I'm moving on, that was chapter 6, and I'm moving on to chapter 7, which is accommodations, which applies to peers because they are known or believed to be people who have a mental health condition or have had one. So employers are already on notice that people have, according to the law, a disability. And not only is providing reasonable accommodations a legal requirement, but I have seen it as a framework for increasing productivity and addressing work difficulties. So people know what an accommodation is. it's a change in the workplace, standard business operations, changing standard business operations to help someone do their essential job functions. And we know what some of those are. And some examples include having flexibility in hours. Some people might have a more difficult time in the morning. Extra training or supervision. That doesn't have to be a permanent thing, but for a period of time, someone might need a little bit more, or if they don't feel like they don't know enough about a topic, training. And time off, which is the last resort, I would say. So the challenge here is that most employers don't really want to get too involved in accommodations, because there are standards, but there's not a clear-cut process for addressing them with employees. In addition, people think it'll cost money. And, you know, when supervisors aren't clear about how to handle things, they tend to back off. And things continue to go on and problems can fester. That could have been addressed. Next slide, please. So this is my key slide. So I just wanted to mention up front that even if a illness is being treated and the person is doing well, that's still considered a disability, because people can still discriminate against that person. So when do you take action? You may get a request. That's obvious. Also, a person may come to you and say, I'm having a job difficulty and I don't feel good. They don't make a formal request, but you still need to address it as something that needs to be addressed with a reasonable accommodation. And recently, the feds made clear in the law that, in the regulations, that if something is otherwise obvious, so a person may not come to you, but if, for example, you know a person is a peer specialist or has a history of depression, and the person starts to show signs in a way that affects their job, then you have a duty to really approach them about that. But even without that law, best practice is if someone's having trouble, you can just simply ask them, is everything okay? And then it's really up to them. But you don't want to wait for a person to slide too much before addressing their job difficulties. So the reasonableness standard. So there are three threshold standards that you are bound by in this Americans with Disabilities Act. Is the accommodation reasonable? So what's the likelihood it's going to work? Is it has it worked in the past for this peer, or has it worked for other peers? There's a lot of flexibility there, and it really is what's going to address the problem. It should meet the needs of the employee, but ultimately it's up to the employer to make the final choice, but it really is a collaborative effort. Undue hardship, one example I like to offer, and I think I have an appendix in there on this, is about leave. You know, what do you do if you give someone leave and you don't have the job filled and you do have an undue hardship, or you could have one? Well, first, when you provide leave, I think you would want to negotiate with the person about when they expect to come back and, you know, what's the plan? What kind of, are they going to get help? I would do that, and I think you're obligated to do that to the extent that 6 months off may be an undue hardship, but if the person can do it in 3 months, you're all set. But maybe that's not required up front. You give the person time off. But what you can also provide is to have a good return to work program. With evidence-based practice, I give an example of CBT here. And by doing that, you really increase the possibility, the likelihood of the person returning to work, even if they're out on disability. Good practices, regardless, you may think the person doesn't have a motivation to return, or they may want to extend it. And that may be true, but it doesn't matter, because these practices do work if the client is somewhat, if the employee is somewhat motivated. Let's see quickly. So it has to be an interactive process between the employer and employee. Exchanges, discussions. If you're rejecting something as an employer, you really need to give a reason why. It's often because it's an undue hardship, so that the employee can come back with another alternative. So transparency is important. You don't want to, these can become emotional discussions. They don't have to be, though. really focus on the issue. Don't get into personalities, and one size does not fit all. Next slide. So here is a process for, I'll just say my major process for addressing accommodations. And the main thing I want to say here is, don't start, when you think about this, about what the person's disability is, or what their problem is, what their emotional problem is. Because that's not what you're really trying to address here. What you're really trying to do is help the person do their job. So the first thing you look at is, what are their job functions? So you have a job description. Then you might want to circle the ones in which you're having trouble with. Then you can begin to think how you're going to help them. Why are they having these difficulties? And if you start with, you know, what's the person's disability, or do they have ADHD? And the person says, I have ADHD. I mean, this is unclear language. And there's a lot of, you know, those discussions can end up as to where do we get a person's services. Before you've really thought about, you know, oftentimes the stress is the person's having trouble with the job. And so by addressing that, you know, you're ideally lowering that stress and anxiety. Quick example, so the orders of these questions matter. I'm don't have time for the examples, but they're in the toolkit. You want to write down the agreement. So in part 2 here, everybody should think about this on their own first, with their advisors, parents, doctors, and seek out as much information as they want to. Before that, in part 3, they have that interactive dialogue. But after that dialogue, you can take another break, return, think about it, so that, you know, you're working together with your employee. And there's a form for this if you want to check out the toolkit. And the key to this is that everybody should be aware, at the workplace, should be aware of the process and the way to request an accommodation. And it's not always clear how to request an accommodation. I think it could be the supervisor that you go to. There should be a good form, although a form's not required. And staff should be trained on the process for addressing accommodations and requiring them, and the value in terms of how they can reduce retention and increase productivity. So next slide, please. So this goes to the issue really about how peers interact with other staff. And, you know, Vanessa alluded to this. The workplace for a peer can sometimes feel somewhat hostile because they can feel like the only person bringing in the values of recovery, peer support, self-determination, and particularly on, you know, really strict clinical teams that feel pressured to keep the person safe and stable, which are good things, but they may not be thinking about the person's employment, housing, and just the person's development of their own sense of being in their decision making, that the person can grow aside from psychiatric difficulties. So, next slide. There we go. Yes. So how do you work with staff around this? The first, well, oops, I think yes, this is, now I'm confused about the slide. I think it was I think, now back to staff awareness and I'm sorry, everybody. Yes, educating is really good. So how do you build relationships between staff and peers? First of all, clarity of role, job clarity. That'll help a lot of people, really, other staff feel at ease. Talk to the staff about what's going to change. So it might not be a radical change, but as a staff person, you really need to understand the peer role, consider their perspective on the job, be comfortable with differences of opinion, and be supportive of peers in their daily work. In other words, peers matter, you're okay, but this will be a different way of doing things. We have some small elements of required trainings, but I also always emphasize the team building around co-learning and sharing. Put people in a group, each person talks about their job and even their life, and that really humanizes people, and the peer to the other people and the other people to peer. And we have some good stuff in there in the toolkit. So let's move on to the next slide. One thing I want to say about training, we can keep it here, but peers, you really want to have lived experience as part of your trainings. So that not only includes young adult peers, but also people who have supervised young adult peers and are perhaps recent converts. Oftentimes, the best trainers are people who at a certain point said, this isn't going to work. And then they do it and they find out this is pretty good. Those are people who can tell you how they went from one place to another, and they can be great trainers. All right, organizational infrastructure. This is brief. Obviously, committed and strong leadership who believe in this role and demonstrate that belief through communications. It's important to have champions in the workplace who advocate for the role in discussions with people who are project directors, vice presidents, whoever, but that really matters because obviously many of us who work in places really need to pay attention to what people above us are saying. And if we hear something enough, it's more likely to say, this is something I really need to take on. So key, connect with human resources. So many times people are hired, young adult peers are hired, and human resources comes in and says, well, what's this? What are we going to do? And we don't have a job classification for that. So, and then the job descriptions end up being really funky. So think about developing a separate job description, this job classification for peers, and don't do this. Many of you are experts, are knowledgeable about the role, but human resources should really be involved because they're the ones who have to ultimately deal with the technical parts of this. And if you do this once, it'll last as long as you continue to hire young adult peers. And human resources should be informed about some of the criminal record issues and that we talked about earlier, not screening people out for reasons that discriminate against young people and also people of color who tend to get caught up in the criminal justice system more. Going through policies and checking language. Checking language to make sure, as I said before, there's not language that's really negative and unhelpful. Sorry, do something here. Benefits counseling is something, people are dealing with Social Security, and they can translate they can work full-time, but sometimes it's good for the company to have benefit support. And finally, around boundaries, we have that in this section, actually. I forget the page, but it's in this section. We have more on boundaries, and I think that's just because it's a universal issue for everybody, and it's something that should be considered throughout the organization. Next slide. Having young adults involved at every phase of planning and integration into leadership obviously will provide young adults with support, and also other staff with education and contact. Contact is the best way to address discrimination. So we have 5 minutes here, I think. In a reasonable amount of time. Let's go on to the takeaways. Or if people have any burning questions, we can answer them. So we have 3 sets of takeaways. And again, as I said earlier, we're looking for, we've developed this and we've applied it in our own work, but it still needs to be really used for us to learn what works best for you depending on whether you're just starting out or if you're doing this. So we have those on recruiting and hiring. They're all in Chapter 5, but recruiting and hiring became an important thing that we devoted time to this. Next set. Emphasize number one. This is probably the biggest takeaway. All staff should understand the purpose and unique qualities of the young adult peer role via orientation, training, team building, and supervision. If people in the organization do not understand the role, that's a major barrier to the success. And there are trainings people can go to, but hopefully the organization embeds this belief system within. All right, next set. So supervision has turned out to be individualized and regular, at least, to be for peer specialists the primary way in which they keep their sanity or do their job. You need someone in your corner, as Vanessa said. Oh, that's so important, so that's something else you really want to put your efforts into. I would say that using an accommodations framework with intelligence and thoughtfulness will really help young adults do their job in a better way, and is a tool for supervisors and others in team building. So, Vanessa, do you have anything else you want to add now that we're towards the end? And as again, we're both available. We're going to provide there. We have a TA line, and we can get back to you on specific questions you have in the Excel sheet that we got. Vanessa, did you want to add anything?
The only thing I would add is just to say thanks everyone for being part of this, and that to access the toolkit we have on the following page. I'm actually going to pull it up. The first link is to the full PDF. The second link that's listed, you can download each chapter individually. So depending on where you're at your organization into integrating young adult peer providers, the different chapters, you could download them. And finally, I just want to say that the toolkit really, really is a great example of practice-based evidence. It has philosophy, practice, and tools that will help guide you in doing good work with young adult peers and integrating them effectively. And John and I are here to help talk through things. We'd love to learn from you. We'd love to learn from you. So feel free to reach out to us. And I think that's it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your attention during this webinar. We're coming to the end. I wanted to let you know that there will be a survey that will pop up for your feedback on this topic and webinar, and we greatly appreciate you taking your time to fill it out. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll forward them to the presenters so that John and Vanessa can take the time to read them and send you a good reply. My email is the one that you get from GoToWebinar, deirdre.logan@umassmed.edu. And again, thank you so much for taking your time today. And be on the lookout for future Spark and Transitions RTC webinars.